Hey everybody, I'm going to talk to you today about.
Making some simple graphs in Excel.
So to start off with, we're going to be working with the iris data set. This is a data set with three different iris species and their length and petal width. So it's commonly used to as an example for all kinds of data visualization. So we are going to make three different kinds of graphs today: a histogram, a scatterplot, and a bar plot. A histogram is used to show the distribution in values of a single variable. So it can show positive or negative, or right or left skew, and the median and its relationship with the mean. It's often a useful tool to do before you're doing statistical analysis. The next graph we're going to talk about is the scatter plot, and this is used for showing the relationship between two continuous variables. In this case, we're going to be showing the difference or the relationship between length and width. And length and width are two really good examples of a continuous variable since there's no levels or categories. And the last thing we're going to do is show you a bar graph, or in this case, in the nomenclature of Excel, a column graph. And this shows the differences in means among categories. In this case, we're going to show you the difference in uh, petal length and petal width among the three iris species. So to start off, we're going to do a histogram, and I want to do a histogram of petal width, but only in one of the species. So I'm going to show you how to filter this data by species. Pardon me. So we're going to select all of the data, and then we're going to go to Data and Filter, and you can see we have these little drop-down menus, and we can just pick one particular species. So the next thing we need to do is ensure that you have the data analysis pack installed. So if you go to Excel add-in and then just look to see that this analysis tool pack is installed. If it's this box isn't checked, you check it, press OK, and it should install the necessary tools. So if you go to the Data tab and all the way to the end, you should see this data analysis box appear if the toolbox is installed. So unlike all of the other graphs we're going to do today, we don't need to actually pre-select the data we want to use. We'll just click on data analysis, and you want to look for a histogram. Click OK. We'll get this dialog box up here, and we want to select the variable that we want to graph. So in this case, I think I said petal length. So I'm going to select all of that. Click OK. We could pre-specify some bin ranges. So this is just the divisions in which we're going to count the frequency of the values. But Excel does a fairly good job generating some reasonable bins, so we're just going to leave that blank. We would like the data to appear in a new worksheet ply, and we want it to generate an output, so we'll just make sure that this box here is checked. We'll press OK, and you can see we have our histogram. It's really ugly, and we're going to have to do a bunch of tweaks before it looks really at all nice. So I'm just going to delete this title here. I'm going to delete this frequency because it's not telling us anything that we don't already know and isn't labeled on the y-axis. I am going to change the number formatting of our bins because they're all kind of very long numbers and we don't need all of those significant digits. So I'm going to format cells. I'll go to number here, and 2 decimal places is lots, so we'll just say that's okay. And you can notice already that our axis tick labels are much more sensible. I'm also going to actually add another number here because it's just graphing everything at this point from 1.77 up to infinity. So I'm just going to throw in a number or a upper bin number that's a equal length to the bin before. So in this case, it looks like about 0.13 between bins. So I'm going to put in 1.90. Okay, so there we have all of our axis ticks. I'm going to make it a little more square. You can actually resize the graph. Format. Yes. Here we go. I'm just going to make it 14 centimeters high by 16 centimeters wide. Gives us kind of a very square look when you take into account the axes. And this is adjusting the size this way. It's a good way to keep your graphs consistent. If you're just resizing them manually, it's easy to make them all kind of different aspects and they look kind of more messy when you're cutting and pasting them into another document. Okay, keeping going with making our graph look nice, I'm going to select our particular data series, double click it, and we should get this format data series thing appear on the side. And I'm going to lower the gap width as much as I can, and this is going to make it look like a more typical histogram. And the other thing you'll notice now that we've moved all of our bars together is you can't really tell where any bar it starts or where the other one bar ends. So I'm going to add some outlines. So I'm going to click here, the paint bucket here, go to border, go to solid line, okay, and pick something that will contrast with the blue. Black's going to work fine. There we go. That looks fine. The other thing we need to do here is kind of just up the text size because everything's kind of small and hard to read. And we should change our x-axis label because bin isn't particularly helpful. So we were doing petal length. So I'm just going to cut and paste this over to here. Paste that in. Okay, and then I'm going to make it a reasonable size. Do something similar on the y-axis. And upsize our tick label. Only going to make them 12, make them a little smaller than the axis labels. Okay. And there we go. We have a nice graph. So that's the histogram down. Let's do a scatter plot. So, okay, we have all of our data. We can actually just select petal length and petal width, the entire columns. Go to the Insert tab, and then we want to select Scatter. And boom, we have a scatter plot. But you'll notice that because the graph is including 0 on both axes, all of our data is kind of shoved to one side. So I'm going to actually fiddle around a little bit with the data range and going to change that a bit. So if we double click on the axis, go to axes options again, and I'm going to pick something maybe 0.75. Okay, that looks reasonable. I'm going to again make the graph the same size, format, make it 14 centimeters tall, 16 centimeters wide. We don't need this title up here. And then one thing we actually do need to add here is our axes label. Otherwise, we don't really know what this graph is saying at all. So if we go back to format, chart design, pardon me. Add chart element. We want to add a horizontal axis label and a vertical axis label. And then this was, yes, I believe it was petal length on the x-axis. Pardon me there, I messed up. Petal length. And don't forget the units. Petal width. Okay. Now we just need to make the text size reasonable again. So we'll go with 14 and 14 and 12 and 12 again for the axis ticks. Okay. So there's our scatter plot. The one other thing we can add to this is a line of best fit, and Excel makes that really easy. Just click on your data points, right click to bring up the menu, and select add trend line. And it's going to, by default, go with a linear line, which looks pretty good. You can select something like a logarithmic or polynomial if that fits better, but I think you should probably be able to get away with the linear line for most things, especially on this assignment. So there we go. There is our scatter plot, the line of best fit, showing the relationship between the continuous variable of petal length and the continuous variable of petal width. And you can see we have a fairly, well, maybe not that nice positive relationship. It's pretty weak, but still there. So that is 2 graphs down. The next thing we need to do is look at a bar graph. So for this, we need to calculate some means. And I think the easiest way to do this with how the data is set up here is to use a pivot table. So these can be really complicated, but I'm going to show you a pretty easy one, and this is going to let us easily calculate the mean values of petal length, petal width for each of the 3 iris species, and it's also going to let us calculate standard deviation so we can make some error bars. So just to make our pivot table, I'm going to unfilter all this data. It's going to kind of mess up our chart. It's actually going to make it include all of the data rather than just the one species, but we can put it back by refiltering the data later. So I'm just going to calculate, just going to select the entire table here, go to summarize with pivot table. So we can see it's got our range of data selected. We want to put this in a new worksheet and press OK. So we have our pivot table builder here. And we want to put species in rows and petal length and petal width in the values box. And it's going to probably not by default be an average, but we can set that to average later. And for Excel, average always means mean. Just something to keep in mind. So I'm going to set it to average for both petal length and petal width. And you can see we have our nice table there. And so if you need to adjust the pivot table later, make sure you have the pivot table analyze tab selected and go to field list. And I'm actually going to add petal length again to the values box. And in this case, I'm going to select standard deviation. So this will let us have a value to add as an error bar later. And I'm going to do the same thing with petal width. There we go. So one thing I'm going to do here right now is just cut and paste this part of the pivot table. I found that if you try and actually make a graph out of the pivot table itself, it never really works, and it works much better if you cut and paste it. So that's something to keep in mind. So we've cut and pasted our data with our means. So petal length, petal width. Select all of this. Go to insert. In this case, column, though everyone calls it a bar graph. Select clustered columns, and bang, we have our raw bar graph, which again we'll need to tweak a little bit to make it look nice. So get rid of the title. I'm going to double click on this legend to move it to the top. And since these are species names, I'm going to italicize them. Oh, and similar to what I did with the histogram, I want to get rid of the gaps between the bars. So I'm going to double click here and set our series overlap to 0. Okay, and I think that looks a little bit better. And what we're missing here again is axes label. So, one other thing. I want to change what is in the legend here. And this is actually drawing from these cells here. So I just want to change it to petal length and petal width to make it a little more compact. There we go. And now we need to add the axis labels as before. So horizontal, vertical, so species on the x-axis, and dimension in millimeters, so don't forget the unit again. So we have our legend and our two axes labels. So again, we need to make all the text bigger because it's really small. First thing, I want to make the graph the same size as before. So 14 by 16. And upsize all the text. 14, 14, 12, 12 for all of our tick labels. Going to make the legend 12-2. All right, and that's a fairly decent bar graph. But if you remember from our first lecture, I think we talked about the importance of error bars because you have no idea how variable this data is. So that is why we calculated the standard deviation before. So if we want to add error bars, we'll just need to click on our first data series here, go to chart design, and add chart element. You can see error bars. Just ignore all of the suggested ones. They're all going to be wrong. You want to go to more error bars, and then you want to select custom, specify value, and we want to put the same thing in for positive and negative error values. So we're just going to select that range that we calculated earlier in the pivot table. Just make sure that you put the petal length error bars on the petal length bars and don't get them mixed up. There we go. So those are the positive error bars, and now the negative error bars. Press OK. There we go. We're going to do the same thing with the petal width. Error bars, more error bars, custom, specify value. There we go. Positive, negative. And there we go. There's our bar graph. We have all of our bars labeled, and we're showing both the petal length, petal width difference on the legend, and the 3 species on the x-axis. Both of our axes are labeled, and we have error bars showing the standard deviation around the mean. So again, to go over the graphs we talked about today, this is the bar graph that we are using to show the difference in means among categorical variables with a continuous response variable that we're taking the mean of. And then we talked about the scatter plot. I'm just going to put it back to filter it so it looks the same as to begin with. So with a scatter plot, well, again, was showing the relationship between 2 continuous variables, and you can add a line of best fit, so you can fit the relationship to better visualize it. And the first graph we talked about was the histogram, which allows us to kind of visualize the distribution of values within one particular variable. So this can show a right or a left skew. It will also show the median, and if the data is symmetrical, all of which can be important to have an idea of before you try and actually analyze the data. So with that, that sort of brings me to the end of my description of all the graphs. Hopefully this video is helpful in case you didn't remember everything we talked about in tutorial. And with that, I'm going to let you guys go. Hope everyone has a good day. Bye.